So indeed, thank you very much for having me. It's very nice to be here, also because I gathered from what Luciano told me before the start of the seminar that you have a very interdisciplinary culture, which is wonderful because that's exactly what I like, and that's also what my institute tends to do. So I am a philosopher of science, mostly, by and large, what people might call an empirical philosopher of science. So the kind of philosopher of science who basically does a lot of social science research and historical research. And I tend to ground my philosophical reflections on that kind of work. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview, some pointers on a project I've been carrying out now for 5 or 6 years at least, and I'm just completing a monograph on this. So, any feedback you might have also, unfortunately I have to run about 6:37 to catch my train, but any feedback you might want to also send me your email, I'd be very, very happy to hear it. And this project was looking very particularly at data-intensive science, what this might be, but within the context of the life sciences. I actually specialize in philosophy of biology, so for me that was a natural starting point, if you want. Confused with what I have in my hand. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pose the question, which I'm sure you've been confronted with several times, of what is actually new about so-called data-intensive, data-centric, data-driven science. And in order to do that, I'm going to look at what I call the concept of data journeys. Sorry. Basically, the idea of what happens to data once they've been produced in a lab or in fieldwork by natural scientists, by biologists, and starts traveling around with the help of particularly online databases. And I'm going to really focus on that infrastructure for this talk. And I'm going to try and pose the idea that, in fact, what's happening here is databases are allowing data to go through lots of different contexts. And in fact, they're multiplying the contexts under which the value of data as evidence can actually be assessed. So I'm going to be looking particularly at 3 contexts: the context of data production, which within philosophy of science is something that we are supposed to know absolutely everything about, has been talked about over and over again. Then I'm going to look at the context of reuse, so the idea that through new technologies, through norms and movements such as the open data movement, actually the same data can be reused in lots of different contexts to generate new findings. And then I'm going to look more closely to the context of dissemination, which is the one I've been doing most of my research on until now, which is what actually happens in this space in between. What makes it possible to go from a context in which you're producing the data to a different context, a different lab, a different location, where data might actually be given a different value altogether. And then I'm going to try and think a little bit about philosophical implications of this. By the way, I'm sorry if the slides have a lot of words compressed. I'm going to try and read them to you if you cannot read them. They're a bit sometimes compressed. So this is just to give you an idea of the general discussion that my work is situated in. But again, I wouldn't think this needs a lot of introduction in this audience. But there is this whole idea that what we're seeing now within the sciences, and certainly in biology, is a sort of data-intensive approach, a data-centric mode, if you want. And this is something which has been put forward, of course, by Microsoft. Particularly, you cannot really see this pointer, can you? OK. But it's been talked about in lots of different audiences, lots of different spaces. And there's many reasons for this. One is the idea that, well, now we have, possibly a new way of doing science, which is on an extremely large scale compared to the past. So some people would argue, well, what's happening here is we have, big science. We have lots of people involved in doing this kind of science. We have projects which are more and more globalized, really involving networks that span through different countries, multiple locations. Particularly in biology, there is a very strong emphasis on synthesis and integration of information. So all of this is actually generating something like a new epistemology for biology, something that gives us a different foundation to create knowledge. There is also an insistence on the fact that there's new technology now available to produce data on organisms particularly. And of course, things like sequencing data, the genomics revolution are the epitome of this kind of claim. And what interests me most, the idea is also that there are new communication technologies which actually allow for much wider and much faster data dissemination. So particularly things like online databases facilitate the travel of data across all these multiple contexts which are involved in this kind of big science efforts. And particularly another thing that interests me a lot here is the idea that actually there is more and more emphasis on data themselves as possibly constituting an output of research. Until now, the idea has been much more that data are something you basically have to establish some claims, but it's the claims that you get at the end which constitute scientific knowledge. This is your legitimate output. It's publication in Nature. You want a promotion. You want to get tenure. This is what you need to get as a scientist. Now, more and more, the idea is becoming significant that actually data themselves as a currency. Data themselves is something that is valuable within scientific circles and can be circulated without necessarily being associated to interpretive claims. And particularly, you see this with the emergence of things like data journals that actually, at least supposedly, only publish data sets and then don't publish claims about data sets or interpretation of data sets. So this is generating this huge scientific debate on data-driven science as a new way of doing research. And I suppose the question I'm asking is it really? And actually, there are several ways in which, as somebody who is trained in philosophy, history, and social studies of science, you might take issue with that claim, with the idea that this is a whole new way of doing science at all. Of course, one could say, well, there's lots of different ways in which we can see novelty here. First of all, there is the fact that we can assemble data in new ways, and we can assemble data on a much larger scale. And we can actually assemble data that comes from lots of different sources. And isn't that a very new thing? Because actually it really does allow us to create new correlations. And I'm sure many people who work in this institute have been writing books like the little book on big data, where this kind of correlative thinking is really hailed as one of the marks of big data epistemology. There's the idea that actually we can consult big data to facilitate discovery and to extract more and more and more meaningful patterns from them. And particularly in biology, there is the idea that actually what this is allowing us to do is, rather than just always thinking about one specific system, one organism, one ecosystem, and really analyzing that in depth, we can use all of these data assemblages to ask more general questions that correlate lots of different ecotypes, lots of different systems, lots of different ecologies. And this is a different way, again, to produce knowledge. But of course, there are problems that comes with it. One of the main problems that philosophers tend to be very concerned with is the problem of interpretation. So it seems like interpreting data is actually typically within science very related to your knowledge about data being produced in the first place. Because you need to know how exactly you calibrated the instrument, how exactly you selected your sample, all these kinds of things. So if you remove data from the context in which you produce them, how on earth are you actually going to be able to assess their value? How are you going to be able to interpret them in any way? Right? And this is particularly pressing as a problem when you consider an area like biology. That's actually why I'm so interested in biology itself. Because biology is such a hugely fragmented discipline, if you can even call it such, which is composed by countless research groups which have completely different methodologies, beliefs, they work on different organisms, they have different theoretical commitments, they have different goals. So how can you assume that these people will be able to understand each other's results, right? Which actually is something which makes philosophers rather skeptical about these big claims about big data, big science, et cetera, et cetera. The skepticism also extends to the notion of data-driven science or data-intensive science. So what is this supposed to be? Some sort of induction? You have lots of facts, you look at all these facts, and then you can make these wonderful extrapolations. Well, at least within philosophy of science, about several centuries of work have gone into dismantling the idea that you can have anything like naive induction. The idea is that people look at scientific work and they kind of observe that, well, actually, there's always a lot of conceptualization behind data collection. Data collection itself is a theory-laden activity, meaning that there's lots of conceptual scaffolding involved in it. When people interpret data, they model them in lots of different ways. They kind of scaffold them and infrastructure them in lots of different ways. So this idea that you can just derive knowledge from data in a straightforward way really doesn't seem to make much sense to somebody who does epistemology or science. And so the question becomes, okay, so if this is not straight induction, so what is it? What makes this kind of reasoning interesting and maybe specific and something which can be separated from other ways in which you reason in science and you produce knowledge? And what role does theory play in these kinds of systems? And also, and this is where historians step in and are even more skeptical, really, when you consider the history of science in detail, how on earth does this differ from what we've seen happen over and over and over again in the history of science, particularly in biology, where at the very least for the last 400 years, we've had over and over again moments in which people wrote actually quite directly about information overload, even up to somebody like Linnaeus kind of assembling a lot of materials to try and provide botanical classification, was completely overwhelmed by the amount of data and samples that people were sending him. So all the way, at the very least from the moment in which people were doing natural history, so they were collecting a lot of samples all over the world and trying to make sense of it, we've had situations in biology where there's been very big samples of data from different sources, collected, analyzed, and disseminated through the aid of various information technologies. So what's actually happening now that makes this a particular moment in the history of biology? Is it just something which is much more continuous than we would expect with previous practices, or are we actually dealing with something relatively new? So these are the kind of questions I'm trying to pose in my work and I'm interested in. And to find answers to the questions, my decision has been to try and actually follow the data, if you want. So actually start to see what really happens, as I said, in this space between the production of data in any one lab or in any one fieldwork and the reuse of data after they've been circulated and disseminated in lots of different ways. So the case study I've been looking at for now a long time, like 10 years or so, is the case of model organism research. Model organisms are these little things here. They are something like mus musculus, the normal kind of house mouse. This is E. coli. This is the little plant Arabidopsis thaliana, which is a very common weed and is the most important plant kind of as a model in biology. This is the fruit fly, Drosophila. So these organisms are all basically, they tend to have in common the fact that they're sort of relatively insignificant, if you want. They're not supposedly representative of the human, but in fact they have been taken over the last 50 years of biology or so as representatives for whole kingdoms of organisms. So for instance, this plant really now is used as the model to study the whole of the plant kingdom, despite the fact that, of course, it bears very little similarity to other plants. And one of the interesting things about looking at things like model organisms is the fact that there's been, over the last 50 years, a set of big communities in biology of people who do all sorts of different types of biology, from cell biology to genetics to ecology, who assemble around these organisms precisely with the hope to try and bring together lots of different data that apply to different levels of the organism and try to understand these organisms as a whole. So it's an explicitly interdisciplinary enterprise. And so that's why I focused on that, because it was a really nice example of a long-term, sophisticated attempt to try and share data and make sense of data and interpret them in a way that would take as much as possible advantage of technologies and really kind of bring together very different types of knowledge. So what I focused on is the databases used to actually get this done. So a database is used to collect, disseminate, and interpret data about these organisms. And I've done an empirical study of how these were developed historically and actually how they keep being modified now. And in fact, I became actually part of quite a few of the steering committees of these databases, so I've actually gone native to a very large extent, I would say. I basically, on one end, I do critical work and I do philosophical work on this material, but I also actually participated in the construction of some of these things, and I collaborated with a lot of these scientists, which I very much enjoyed and actually think gave me quite some insight on how these things actually work. So in my view, this was not a problem methodologically, but I just wanted to flag it in case you're interested in this and want to discuss it. So this is the kind of thing I'm thinking about when I'm thinking of data journeys. Typically, we start from data that look something like this. So you can have very different formats. This is like the typical, kind of stereotypical sequence data. This is just an example of data which are called microarrays. All these little dots symbolize the expression of particular genes in a particular organism or in a particular genome. And this is actually a very complex reconstruction of data about chlorophyll flow in a leaf. And so any of these types of data that can pertain to lots of different aspects of the organism are typically submitted or anyhow co-opted by databases like this. This is database actually devoted to the little plant I showed you before, which is one of the most important databases in plant biology in general. And then something happens in here. And then typically you can browse in lots of different ways the databases, and you can get all sorts of results. You can retrieve data in their original format, or you can actually retrieve them in very interesting visualizations that bring different data sets together in lots of different ways according to all sorts of different parameters. And typically, what I'm now generally thinking about when I'm thinking about the travel of data is the travel from a context of production, which produces data in those formats, to a context of dissemination, which we'll talk about, which is whatever happens in here, to a context where data are actually retrieved, accessed by scientists, retrieved, and reused in formats that are kind of visualized and coordinated by the databases. So just to go to the context now, talk a little bit about context of data production. As I said, this is the kind of context that philosophers of science and historians of science have spent pretty much all their time analyzing, of course, STS people too. And the idea here is that scientists produce data to explore, develop, verify, corroborate, all sorts of things, hypotheses, models, theories. There's a lot of variety here. The assumption here is that actually we know all about this some way, somehow, or at least we've really explored this in our fields in a very deep way. And if there is one thing that really comes out strongly from all of this literature, is the idea that data are embedded in this context. They're essentially context dependent. You cannot get data out of whichever context it is that produces them, because suddenly you're going to lose all the elements you need to actually be able to interpret it in the first place, right? And there's various arguments for that. Of course, many of them focusing on the nature of the instruments used, the materials used, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And out of these kinds of considerations come things such as the idea of theory-ladenness, the fact that data are always theory-laden, so one needs to know in which theoretical context they've been produced. And the literature on so-called underdetermination. This is, generally speaking, if you don't know what it is, this is the philosophical idea that underdetermination happens when a particular set of data, particular type of evidence, does not immediately correspond to a particular claim. You can actually interpret it in lots of different ways. And that actually is seen as a big problem in philosophy of science, which I don't agree with, but that's another story, another talk. Now, context of data reuse. If you take this literature from the history and philosophy of science seriously, actually the whole movement of open data and big data makes no sense, right? Because one of the mottos of this movement actually is something like, the best use of your data will be discovered by someone else. The idea here is that actually what we're trying to do by establishing databases, by sharing data in the first place, is to allow other people who might have a different background to access this information and hopefully give it a different spin because they come from a different background, right? So it's a complete kind of twist on the idea that actually data are embedded in a context. The idea is, well, yeah, that's true on one end, but let's try and find ways in which maybe by varying the context, we might actually make data more productive. We might expand the evidential value, which is how I'm putting it in the book. So the idea behind something like the open data movement is exactly the fact that data can and should be as much as possible reused. They cost a lot of money to produce. They basically are an investment to some extent. So we should find ways to actually make them available to as many people as possible, and people who are not the original producers, right? And the idea is, of course, that we want this context too, the context of data reuse, to be, hopefully, as different as possible for context one, because this actually maximizes the opportunity that people in context two might have a completely different way of looking at the same material. But how do these people, do the scientists in context two, interpret data without having some familiarity with context one? That's when the big problem starts, right? And the idea here that I want to propose is that what actually you need to do is you need to recontextualize data. So you actually need to be aware both of the characteristics of the context of production, context one, and the characteristics of the context of reuse, and be able to compare them with each other. And it's through that comparison that you're actually managing to assign evidential value in a way that's credible and valid in science, again, to the data. So this is where the context of data dissemination comes in. The context of data dissemination, which for me is really encompassed and sort of embodied by the work that goes on in databases, is actually where people try to do that work, to allow people who are at the reuse end of the spectrum to access information about the context of production, but only that information that will actually enable them to interpret data in some way, right? And to actually compare their expertise to the expertise of people who actually produce the data in the first place. So the key locus, as I said, for this data dissemination context is, for me, online databases. And the key actors have been people who are actually in charge of databases. So I spent a lot of time working with database curators. And what was very interesting for me is that these curators are in charge of doing a lot of things to the data so that this movement, this travel from production to reuse can actually happen. And these things include things like classifying, ordering, and visualizing data in all sorts of different ways. And the goal of this is indeed to facilitate this recontextualization. And we can talk about, of course, the professional background of these people if you want, and how exactly they do this kind of work. But for now, I'm just going to go through the context more quickly. So actually, the key process through which this kind of dissemination happens is what I'm instead calling decontextualization. So one of the first things that curators need to do when they're trying to make data travel is to extract data quite actually physically, as physical objects, from the context in which they're being produced, and make decisions about which information, which metadata, in other words, should travel together with those objects, so as to actually facilitate recontextualization. So first you want to strip data of their context, and then you want to be able to recontextualize them. And the fact that you actually are actively doing these two things, decontextualizing and recontextualizing, is absolutely essential, because it actually involves all sorts of actions and decisions that need to be taken, need to be made, so that this can actually happen. It is not going to be something that just happens automatically. And the requirement really for trying to get this to work is to actually have some vision of what it takes to recontextualize data in the first place. So for instance, when I'm moving data around about a particular organism, one of the ideas within model organism biology is, well, actually, one type of information I really need, because otherwise I cannot make any sense of sequence data in front of me, which I might retrieve from a database. I need to know which organism this data come from, right? And this is a decision to actually take that as a parameter which you're going to have to insert in your database as metadata, like to travel together with your data. Interestingly enough, even that, which seems like an obvious thing that a biologist would want to know, is a very contentious point. Particularly in clinical research, actually a lot of people don't want to know about that information, which is very interesting, and we can discuss. So a lot of my work has gone into looking very specifically at the curatorial techniques used to decontextualize data and then to facilitate the recontextualization in the context of reuse. So one of the things I've been looking at are the labels used for this kind of data retrieval. And these are things, at least in the systems I looked at, which are called biontologies. And one of the arguments I've been trying to make is that actually, if you look at some of these labeling exercises, they get very close. In fact, in some cases, they become a theory-making activity. What people are actually doing when they're putting together these labeling systems is actually they're creating representations of knowledge about what people actually know in biology. And this is quite an important thing because, of course, it goes against the idea that making data travel is purely an inductive process. I mean, there's a lot of conceptual scaffolding being built, even just in terms of classifying the data, so that people can actually access them and retrieve them in the right way. And I've been looking at all sorts of different processes to package data in this way. So some of them involving even just the selection of data in the first place. And we can talk a lot about this because, of course, how data who travel around these databases are selected is partly a question of decision-making by curators, and probably for the majority, a question of specific situations of where the funding is for particular sciences, which institutional arrangements, and which kind of economic forces are shaping the kind of selection of data. So particularly in biology, for instance, image data tend to travel very little because they're very difficult to handle. Nobody wants to invest in them. They're very problematic still. Well, of course, genomic data travel all over the place because by now they're relatively cheap to make for the people who have the machines, right? And there's all sorts of interesting dynamics there in terms of then what actually gets assembled at big data. But again, that's another talk. There's a question about formatting of this data and, of course, all sorts of processes of modeling and visualization that go into packaging the data. One thing I am particularly interested in is the way in which these kind of curatorial techniques very often involved a lot of concern with trying to formalize what philosophers have typically referred to as tacit knowledge. everything that tacit in this particular case. The assumption here is that not only how you conduct your experiments is something that can actually be talked about, but in fact it's something that can be articulated to the extent that you can have metadata that actually describes these activities and allow people who haven't witnessed these processes, who are working in the context of reuse, to form an impression, an image in their head of what actually happened originally in the context of production. And this, pretty much anybody who works in the model organism biology case agrees, is absolutely key. Without having some way of actually capturing, articulating the kind of embodied knowledge, even the ways people move in the context of production, then it becomes very, very, very hard to recontextualize data at the other end. And just to give you an example, I mean, this is just a quote I typically give from the director of the database I showed you before, which shows a little bit the scope and the ambition of these kinds of attempts, where she's saying, and this is from 2004 or so, I mean, the extent to which it actually, of course, has succeeded is very limited, but the goal in implementing that kind of database was to provide the common vocabulary, visualization tools, and information retrieval mechanisms that permit integration of all knowledge about the particular plant into a seamless whole that can be queried from any perspective. This was, of course, the vision, and is the vision behind a lot of these data infrastructures. I mean, people, of course, have by now realized very amply that this is completely impossible, but it's still very interesting to see that this is the recognition that there's going to have to be so much work going into the context of dissemination for this whole idea of reuse to even make any sense. Now, let's get to the idea of data journeys a bit more philosophically at this point. So one question that one might ask out of this is, okay, so what does it actually take to transform data into knowledge in cases like this? What do we learn from looking at data journeys in a particular way and considering the role of technology in doing this? And my interpretation of this is that actually what it takes to transform data into knowledge, to extract patterns from data that can be found meaningful for formulating claims about phenomena, is to develop a context for research that suits data interpretation for one's purposes, and at the same time takes account of data properties and the provenance of data. So the question here is to find, if you want, a middle ground, which then becomes a whole new context, in which you can actually bring together your own expertise as somebody who is going to a database. Say I'm a cell biologist, I'm interested in the metabolism of a particular organism. I go to a database and I think, okay, well, I don't know anything about this organism, but maybe there's something interesting I can find about the data that they hold. And I type in cell metabolism in the retrieval, in their kind of searches, and I get all sorts of data sets from there. So the question is, how do I go from being somebody who says working on mice and is interested in cell metabolism, and accessing kind of some existing data produced by completely different labs on plants, on the same genes in cell metabolism, and making use of that knowledge to inform my project, right? And the idea here is that what the databases are doing is constructing a sort of middle ground context within which that kind of exchange is possible. And I can actually use, in a sense, critically, my knowledge of my own techniques and like my own training to evaluate, in a different way, of course, the work done by people who are working on different organisms with different tools and different commitments. So the idea here, oops, I'm sorry. So the idea here is that this is a situation where you're assuming that the evidential value, the value of data as evidence, is not predetermined in any way. And in fact, you're actively trying to extend it and expand it by exposing this data to as many contexts as you possibly can. And this, I would say, is actually, generally speaking, one of the most productive features of data as an object within science, as a component of science, and probably something that really characterizes it as something which is different from, say, a model in science or a theory in science. So the fact that data are undetermined is not a problem. Is actually the motor of scientific research, or at least such is considered in these kinds of discussions. So I suppose, and of course, I mean, we could discuss at much greater length which definition of data I'm actually using here. This is, in fact, what most of my book is devoted to. But just generally speaking, just to give you the definition, and we can discuss it if you want, is basically any material product of research activities which is A, treated as potential evidence for any claim about phenomena, and can be circulated across a community of scientists, actually possible to exchange it in some way. Now, what are some philosophical implications of thinking about data in this particular sense? First of all, the idea that portability becomes a really crucial characteristic of data, and in fact, I would say the main one. Data are not something that, if two scientists are working together in a lab and they both witness something happening, say, I don't know, two slime molds going in different directions after some kind of intervention, witnessing the act is not per se data. It becomes data in the moment in which it's actually formalized and in fact objectified and concretized in a way that can actually be transported and exchanged and used like to give it to other peers and people who actually weren't there witnessing that particular moment. So in that sense, portability to me becomes really a defining characteristic of data, which of course depends crucially on the specific domains through which data are made to move. Another philosophical implication here is actually what counts as data in the first place is not something which depends on listing certain properties. There are no intrinsic property to data as such, right? I mean, that's an extreme conception, and many people think it's trivial. However, the implications of it are rather problematic, and I'm still working through them. It's certainly very different, say, from the story that the Royal Society, for instance, has come up with in their latest report on what constitutes data in science, which is a fantastic report, by the way, if you're interested in it. It's called Open Scientific Enterprise, something like this. And the idea there, I mean, they're defining data as specific attributes of a phenomenon. So they're defining data in relation to particular things they represent about a phenomenon. What I'm doing is completely going away from that, and instead saying, no, in fact, what data represent, no matter how realistic a representation they seem to be of something, even if it's a photograph, actually what they represent depends on the context. And what we're interested here in terms of defining the data, instead, is the way they're actually used and the evidential value they're being assigned. So what counts as data in the first place depends on the procedures and context through which researchers attribute evidential value to these particular objects and processes. Again, we can discuss this claim. And so if you take these implications into account, third implication is that the fruitfulness of data-intensive science can then be understood as resulting from the skillful use of information technologies to articulate and multiply the context in which different types of data can be organized and interpreted. Note, I'm not being a technological determinist here. The idea is not to say, oh, we have new technology to disseminate data, brilliant, that's where data-intensive epistemology comes in, that's where novelty comes in. The idea here is that we have a skillful use of, indeed, new information technologies, which of course pertain to very specific regimes of data dissemination, which are embedded in very particular institutions. And so all of these things actually come into play in making this something which is relatively novel on the scene of the history of biology. So it's not just a question of technology, right? But the important thing is all these different factors come together to multiply the context in which data can actually be made to travel and can be organized and interpreted. So what I'm trying to defend here is the idea that we're not really looking at an inductive scenario here. We don't have a situation where you have a lot of data and they can all be put in the same box. And because you can look at all this data in the same box, then you can suddenly make new claims. Rather, you have a situation in which the fact that you can situate data in very specific ways with new tools and within very particular institutional settings actually is making a difference to how science is carried out. So inference from data here is not a question of induction or deduction. It could actually arguably be a question of abduction. That's something that would interest a philosopher, probably nobody else. But but basically, just to cut the long story short, even if we think about that as a way of reasoning, we still have to think about what it means that for an abductive process to actually be carried out in different ways. And I think that difference is accounted for by shifts in context. So I guess in the final part of my project, I'm really interested in actually defining what a context is in the first place in a more philosophical sense. But basically, just to round up this talk, the idea here is that we have a process of situating data which can happen in relation to elements of relevance for particular interpretive acts. And so, things that allow us to situate data in particular ways may include materials, instruments, interests of different people, social networks, norms, what counts as evidence. And what I'm trying to argue here is that identifying patterns, kind of evidential patterns out of data, producing knowledge out of them, which are deemed to be scientifically meaningful, is actually entirely situation dependent, completely depends on the specific context in which data land and are given significance. But of course, that doesn't mean that it's unique or reproducible. I mean, the whole point of science is that you're creating context which can be extended and compared to others. And I think this kind of view is very much reflected into the interviews I made with a lot of curators, where I was constantly being told that actually the most important thing to a database, at least within the context of biology, is the ability of a database to actually allow its users to shift the possible context in which data can be considered. So change the parameter of the searches, change the way in which they're visualized, and compare these different ways of organizing data in as many ways as possible. And this is really the key to making that tool productive. It's not just the fact that you have lots of data in the same container. So conclusion, is data-intensive biology the new epistemology of science? Well, what I'm trying to argue here is that data-intensive science is not inductive, at least not in a naive sense. Rather, the accumulation, the dissemination, and the analysis of data is accompanied, needs to be, by the careful development of research context in which data need to be situated in order to be interpreted. And that technologies such as online databases are really important in that sense, not so much just because, also because they give you new opportunities to do things, but also because they give you opportunities to actually channel much broader movements in data journeys, which have to do with, how you conceptualize research, who is involved, et cetera, that actually can get, in some way, somehow channeled and used within databases. One of the things that for me is interesting here, of course, is to note that these kinds of research contexts within which data are being interpreted, certainly within biology, are only partly the control of individual scientists. I mean, in philosophy of science is still very much stuck on this idea that there is one scientist who makes the discovery and all the Nobel Prizes and all the rest of it. Well, I think in this kind of picture it's very clear that what's happening is institutional, financial, cultural features, insights, infrastructures developed by all sorts of different groups also play a key role here. So one of the things that for me is really important in thinking about data-intensive science, certainly in biology, is the idea that we're looking at a process of distributed reasoning, where lots of different groups are involved in lots of different parts of even just forming the same database. And all of these groups are taking very important epistemic decisions about how you conceptualize data, how you might eventually reinterpret them, how you might recontextualize them in the end. And it's the collective ensemble of all of these interventions that, at least in some cases, makes it possible to reuse data at the other end. And one of the things that people keep emphasizing to me in terms of at least the databases in this context is that what really matters here, what makes a database successful, and there's lots of cases of this in these kinds of environments, is the extent to which, rather than making decisions that people don't challenge and becoming black boxes, they actually allow people to engage actively with each other's assumptions. So they become a platform through which different groups, say IT people, different branches of biology, regulators, funders, can actually have a critical discussion about which assumptions are made when disseminating certain data and when trying to interpret them. So I suppose the upshot in trying to answer my kind of main question for this talk is not really that the novelty of data-intensive science, which is certainly there, but it doesn't come from any of the specific elements which are typically invoked, as in, we now have lots of data, that's the novelty, or, now we have amazing technology, that's the novelty. But actually is the salience that all of these different elements are actually acquiring within scientific discourse and within regulatory discourse, within scientific institutions. And so there's a sense in which, one thing that one can, I think, say, also looking at the history of biology, engagement around data handling practices, so the extent to which people really focus their scientific discussion on those rather than on the knowledge that you might obtain out of them, has actually been, so far, quite limited. People were not really engaging with them quite so upfront. And now this is really becoming one of the main sites for scientific discussion. I think that's actually probably one of the most important shifts that we've seen when considering data-intensive biology. And I'll leave it at this because I hope we can have some discussion. And just to acknowledge the fact that most of the research is funded by the ERC right now.
Thank you.